think the scariest robots that we'll have going forwards, and UGVs in general, will be these drone swarms. You somewhat see it already with UAS. Now imagine you have that on land, you have 1,000 of them, and you strap a grenade to all of them that has a proximity explosive device on it. You then throw 1,000 of those in a straight line towards where you think the enemy might be. That is absolutely horrifying, and I think that's exactly where we're going to end up going with UGVs in about probably within 10 years, definitely, and if we have a major conflict with somebody like China or somebody like Russia, tomorrow. My name's Sam Hart. I'm the Senior Land Analyst at Shephard Defence Insight. My main focus is on armoured infantry fighting vehicles, main battle tanks, unmanned ground vehicles and artillery systems. So UGVs are definitely a very much an emerging market. It's moving very rapidly at the moment. But the main thing about them is that they're going to become probably one of the largest components of most European, certainly NATO armed forces. And if we kind of look wider afield, places like China, for example, probably the leading manufacturer, developer and user of UGVs in the current climate. The main reason that they're being then looked at is the ability for UGVs to provide cheap mass. So instead of having to have lots of humans on the battlefield or lots of very expensive manned vehicles, you have non-human mass that can compete directly with human mass at a lot lower cost in terms of human life, physical kind of economic cost, and then also just the fact that because there's so many of them, from a tactical advantage and a tactical point of view, it's less of a problem if you start losing them in large numbers. The market's very much at an infancy stage, so it's quite a new developing market, as I've kind of already mentioned. We'll talk about later some of the key drives behind this. But the three key areas I've kind of highlighted for development at the moment in the UGV market, especially within kind of military applications, is within the medium market. So this is looking at things like last mile resupply. The larger markets, this is things like the robotic combat vehicle programs coming out of the US. So this is kind of taking a almost car-sized vehicle and sticking some big guns, for the lack of a better term of describing it, sticking some either rocket launchers or machine guns on the top, and turning those into fast-moving, aggressive combat vehicles. And then finally, we've got these very heavy platforms. So these are kind of maybe tank-sized, certainly tank weight, unmanned vehicles, and they're mainly being used for engineering purposes at the moment. So you stick a big digger on the front or mine flails, all of this because engineering work is inherently dangerous. And the moment you make it unmanned, it becomes considerably less dangerous. So there's kind of a few key drivers that I'd pull out of this then. So the main one that seems to be hitting at the moment is range and endurance. So these platforms need to be able to operate at range away from quick local resupply. Often these are the resupply assets. So you can't have a UGV moving from kind of the rear echelon up to the front line and then needing a resupply halfway when it's doing the resupply. So that seems to be the biggest constraint at the moment. Kind of we're seeing even in the last kind of year, 2 years, we've gone from some platforms having ranges of less than 5 miles to some platforms now at the very top end are reaching over 100 miles in the range that they've got. And we're talking platforms that are the size of your sofa. So kind of the autonomy that they need to have for this, the power packs that they have to have and the engine they have to have on this, it's a massive constraint of keeping things cheap, keeping things small and light, but also having the payload and the range to be able to compete with manned platforms or just kind of somebody carrying it. The other things then that are massively impacting and the key drivers is the ability for platforms to have beyond line of sight control. So what that means is it's very easy to either have it wired or have somebody looking at it with a controller in their hands, kind of playing away with it. The ability to be able to control something from ideally not even in the same country ultimately is a massive driver as well. So I was at DVD last week, kind of the UK's Expo, looking at future capabilities. One of the things that the main focus of DSTL, the British kind of research for the military institution, is doing at the moment is experimenting with beyond line of sight. The problem with this then is you start having problems with cost. So this is not cheap, especially developing it, and the relative cost of these platforms, if they're going to be able to achieve mass, has to be cheap. And then the final component that's one of these key drivers is all about autonomy. This is probably the most immature out of all of these things, and it's the problem that a lot of these UGVs are currently facing. Yeah, so last mile resupply is exactly as the name suggests. It's the ability to move logistics or move arms, weapons, people, radios, anything over that last mile. So you can take a big truck that's not very well armed, probably not very survivable, but is highly mobile. You can get that within, say, a mile of the front line, but then you obviously don't want to push it that final mile because then it starts getting shot at, artillery, drone strikes, everything. So you need to have a way of moving things that last mile. So UGVs are a perfect kind of halfway house of how you can achieve this, and it also means that you can reduce the human strain, so you don't have people having to carry across dangerous terrain where they're kind of very exposed, kind of like maybe heavy rocket launchers or large kind of equipment and bags and radios. So that's the main thing that they're being used for at the moment, especially if we look at NATO and to a smaller extent, I guess, zeroing in on this, the US, but certainly within Europe, that seems to be the main focus. I've loosely touched then on some of the other things that are being developed at the moment. So the main ones on that then are going to be ISR. So you've kind of got big radios, big radars as well. So they're using them just as a way of putting out a rebroadcast station for radios, or they're using them as putting kind of radars on that can be used as part of counter battery fires. So you put a massive radar on it, artillery fires towards you, and it, because it's in a weird spot that you wouldn't want to put a human in, is able to get early detection on where artillery is coming from, so you can then throw your own artillery back at it. I think hybrid will be the minimum expectation for a lot of UGVs going forwards. The ability for things like silent watch and silent running. So what that basically means is if you've got a big diesel engine on a vehicle, you'll hear it going chug, 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 no matter what it's doing, no matter where it is. It's always noisy. As quiet as you can make them, you'll still be able to hear them. With things like electric engines, you can minimize that noise signature significantly. So silent watch, as it suggests, is the ability to just, for lack of a better way of describing it, stick one of these UGVs in a bush for 12 hours with its battery pack working and nobody will hear it. So if you're, again, doing things like that radio rebroadcast, doing that thing like that counter battery detection, this silent watch mode that's not available unless you have a hybrid or a fully electric engine just isn't an option. Silent running then is kind of the ability to do silent watch but moving, and again, if you've got a diesel engine, you'll definitely hear it, but this now allows you to do kind of silent approaches. So if you're putting this into a combat operation, you could do a noisy diesel approach for the first 5 miles, and in that last mile, you go into hybrid, you go into electric, and suddenly you're sneaking up on the enemy. So already you can see just very simply how that's a massive bonus in the UGVs alone. The other thing then that's really important, and it's actually going to be able to answer a problem that a lot of armed forces are having at the moment, is increasingly the dismounted soldiers, their kit and equipment requires electrical power. You get things like ATACs, which are like little phones that go on your chest and flip down, and allow you to have better understanding of the battlefield picture. The ability to recharge those has become a significant problem for a lot of militaries. If you've got soldiers operating at range, away from vehicles, away from infrastructure for, say, 3 days, all of these kind of mobile phone devices, just like yours at home, stop working. You put a UGV with them, with an electrical power pack, so now you've literally got, for lack of a better way of describing it, a plug socket in the wall that you can charge. If you haven't got in a hybrid engine, you can do that, but then you haven't got silent watch, so then you can't do it quietly, so you've got to have a diesel engine making loads of noise, so you as a sneaky beaky soldier can then charge your phone. It's a bit of a weird one, but this is where those hybrid engines are massively coming in. Unsurprisingly, the debate from kind of armoured vehicles on tracked versus wheeled platforms is completely transferred into the UGV market as well. It's, as I say, that usual debate of, do we want to be able to move quickly across all terrains, or do we want to move rapidly across limited terrains? I think one of the things that we're seeing at the moment on that, if I apply it from my usual home ground of armoured vehicles, is that wheels are starting to take over from trucks. If you look into Ukraine, mobility over certain terrain rapidly is being seen more favourably than slower mobility over all terrain. There's obviously going to be time and places for this. Ultimately, you are going to put tracks on a tank and you're going to put them on large infantry fighting vehicles. But unless it's a direct combat fighting vehicle, you're probably going to choose wheels. We're seeing it in artillery, we're seeing it in infantry fighting vehicles, as I say, with things like Boxer coming forwards. And it's all about understanding the current and future requirements for these platforms. If you're wanting to mount heavy caliber weapons, it's 12.7 millimeters, or your 50 cal weapons and above, you're probably going to need tracks, just because things like stability become a problem. It's like, kind of, imagine trying to fire one of those weapons on a dinghy in the middle of the North Sea. You're going to end up in the water. If you have it on wheels, you lose that stability unless you probably put in 8 wheels and it's huge, at which point just go tracks. It'll be smaller profile. But if you're doing things like logistics, if you're doing things like moving casualties, if you're doing things like putting radios or just trying to swarm and move quickly, and it's all about mass, then wheels will likely be the better option. It's the exact same debate in the armoured vehicles, and it's just transferred to UGVs. For a bit of a cop-out answer as kind of a summary of this, no one really knows what it's going to be at the moment. I mean, if you go to places like Eurosatory, where I think 3 to 5 new UGVs were unveiled, they're all very, very similar. 3 of them had wheels, 2 of them had tracks, and they all agreed that the other ones were wrong. It's just going to become a case of just dependency on what the mission requires. And I would probably argue that the best outcome, if you're a manufacturer, is to produce a platform that has some degree of functionality where you can switch between them. A bit like if you want to have the mission modules on top, have the ability to have mission modules on the bottom. So the US is roughly 3 years ahead of kind of the rest of Europe and its NATO allies. With programs like its SMET program, this awarded contracts about 3 to 4 years ago now, and this was for about 600 of the same vehicles, that last mile resupply, medium UGV, not armed. And then you also see with its programs like the robotics combat vehicle, that we're expecting to kind of get some press and some time at AUSA next month, that they are, as I say, a few years ahead of the rest of Europe. Europe is at the moment is very much in its trial and development phase. It's not really got any platforms coming through into maturity. It's looking at experimenting with, say, 3 to 5 of any given platforms. Sticking on my comfortable ground of sort of the British market, DSTL is playing with about 3 platforms. The main one it's playing with is the Hippo, and they admitted at DVD they have 4 of them. So it's not a large market. Europe as a whole is very similar, whereas, as I say, the US is miles ahead. The reason for this then is that the US is more kind of defined as a market because it's less politically defined as a market and less politically constrained as a market. What I mean by this then is that for a lot of Europe, they're not really able to experiment much with combat UGVs at the moment due to the political ramifications. We can talk about this more in a little bit, but what this means is you look at the news and you see things like our government is playing with killer robots and people start to panic. Just for the reasons of the America being America, America is able to kind of avoid that to a certain degree, or certainly hide that behind the scenes a little bit more. These political constraints are likely the largest blocker to a lot of Europe, but it's one of those things that will likely then change as we go forward in the next few years. And then the final point I'll raise on this is very much kind of, if you look at the US, in typical US fashion, they have the budget and they have the money for it. These are all brand new markets. These are all brand new platforms. There probably hasn't in the land domain been a new market for quite a few years. We're probably talking 50 years since there's been a new market in the world for land vehicles. Therefore, countries are kind of reluctant to do heavy investment into this, whereas the US has the budget to do this, has the budget to work out exactly what they want to do with these platforms. Whereas for a lot of Europe, they have a concept of a plan, to steal from Donald Trump here, but they don't have a plan of exactly what they want to do with these platforms. Whereas the US has Donald Trump, so not only do they have a concept of a plan, apparently they also have a plan. I'm going to somewhat get on my soapbox here and talk about where I think UGVs will end up, rather than where they kind of are now and where a lot of people are talking about them going in the next 5 years. We're very much constrained on the idea of having, as I say, either car-sized or sofa-sized robots. I think the scariest robots that we'll have going forwards, and UGVs in general, will be these drone swarms. You somewhat see it already with UAS. So, I mean, look at it from a civilian point of view. There's firework displays, for example, in kind of Southeast Asian countries that are just drones going up into the sky and pretending to be fireworks. Now imagine you have that on land, you have 1,000 of them, and you strap a grenade to all of them that has a proximity explosive device on it. You then throw 1,000 of those in a straight line towards where you think the enemy might be. That is absolutely horrifying, and I think that's exactly where we're going to end up going with UGVs in about probably within 10 years, definitely, and if we have a major conflict with somebody like China or somebody like Russia, tomorrow. Genuinely, these are one of those things that I'm not going to be the first person to think of. I'm not going to be the first person to talk about, and they're incredibly, incredibly easy to turn into reality, and they're going to be cheap. Kind of those small robotic cars that you had as a kid driving around, or if your kids have got them driving around your house. Imagine sticking a small AI chip into that, sticking a grenade on the top of it, and driving it towards the enemy. That's exactly where UGVs will go in the future. The biggest blocker to this then is things like autonomy, so just the lack of maturity in this product. So we just don't have the ability to really do that on the land domain at the moment. It's a bit easier in the sky because there's less things in front of you, but you go onto land and suddenly you've got trenches, you've got trees, you've got buildings, you've got steps. Sounds stupid, but it can't really go down, it can't really go up steps. But one of these things changing will suddenly completely open up how UGVs can be utilised. The big thing that they were talking about last week at DVD was the current developments on autonomous tactical behaviour. So if you're a human being and you start being shot at, the first thing you probably do is just get behind a big wall or something that will stop bullets. If you're a robot and you start getting shot at, the first thing you do is when the human tells you to do it. That's a huge problem because it just means there's going to be a massive time lag between human and robot interactions. The moment robots can start doing that properly, they can utilise cover, they can make decisions on the fly and take tactical approach routes. This will completely change how UGVs are able to function. So for things like your armed UGVs, so going back to your more traditional stick a large weapon system on the top of your UGV, that's going to be the biggest game changer for them. There's going to be then obviously development changes in kind of these platforms as a whole. I've touched quite significantly there on the AI and the autonomy and kind of the maturity required in that. But going back to a more practical, physical sense, things like the power packs. So can they get stronger? Can they be smaller? Can they be lighter? Can they be more efficient? That's going to become huge as well, because the moment you start increasing range or increasing the power of the platform, you can increase things like payloads. It just will open up what these UGVs can be used for, because they become less of a constraint and more of a freedom that you can utilize. The other thing then is going to be things like communication systems. So as I mentioned earlier, things like beyond line of sight are becoming very, very important. The ability to control these platforms without needing to either look at it or have kind of a wire to it in the most basic sense. That's going to be huge, and how you control that. But the biggest kind of problem they have at the moment with this is the fact that it's really easy to intercept. These robots, if you're controlling them at range, it's no different to using a phone or encrypted communications. The very least, a peer-on-peer enemy can detect where the radio signal is being sent from, where it's being sent to. These are kind of things that need to be dealt with, and kind of there needs to be a way for these countries and governments and armies and everybody involved in that supply chain to be able to develop this. I think that'll be one of the big constraints as well going forwards. I think the market's going to be split on two trajectories. If the West stays not involved in any major conflicts and it continues at kind of ceteris paribus, it doesn't change over the next 5 to 10 years, I think there's a pretty well-defined path of how UGVs will be developed. I think in the next 3 to 5 years, so probably just before the end of the decade, it will be a main focus on things like your last mile resupply, your engineering, your minesweeping, very much your combat service support platforms. So nothing directly aggressive, and nothing particularly pushing the boundaries. I then think that if you kind of take 2030 onwards, you're going to start looking at the development and low-level integration of things like your combat UGVs. So these will be on a much smaller level. These will not be swarm, this will not be in mass. This will be that, say, every infantry platoon gains one combat UGV, with the idea of, if you're taking a building, you put it through the door first, so you're not sacrificing a human being, potentially. I then think from 2035 onwards, so this is now very much kind of putting that kind of crystal ball moment together, looking 10 years ahead. That's when we'll start to see mass. This is just as much driven by political will as it is probably by product maturity. There's going to be a lag in the time that it takes to turn the vision that everybody has into a physical product that can be utilised by militaries. And you've also got to remember that just the way that a lot of Western military procurement goes, it's not quick. And especially when you're starting to push things and you're pushing the boat out with new products, it's never going to be a quick process. I do think, though, there will be rapid growth within the market. So if you're a manufacturer, you're somebody interested in this market, there's incredibly low barriers to entry. You take something like a main battle tank, and you're talking ridiculously large logistics change, even just manufacturing it and finding the physical steel today is not an easy task. But if it's something like a UGV, they're a lot smaller. There's less of a kind of a focus on protection for them. They don't need to be particularly protected. The main thing is kind of that cost, lethality, and mobility, probably mobility being number one for it. So if you are a company looking at investing in it, it's probably quite an easy market to break into relative to the wider industry. And then, probably the 4 main ways and the 4 main directions that this market will go that maybe aren't being explored fully at the moment are things like dumb logistics. So if you have one JLTV, let's say, driving at the front of a convoy, so a 4x4 vehicle, if you had 20 4x4, 8x8, 6x6, whatever size UGVs, that all it had to do was just focus on the back panel of the vehicle in front and drive behind it, you've just reduced the human strain you need on a very vulnerable logistics convoy by, what's that, probably 700%. So I think dumb logistics is going to become a big thing going forwards. The biggest, most attractive offering of UGVs is that it doesn't require a human being. So if you can do that and think about everywhere that a human being is currently employed that is dangerous, that is a market for a UGV. On the second side of that, then you've got things like intelligence gathering. So I talked about those little remote control cars that your kids buzz around your house on Christmas Day. Imagine now sticking on that like a massive microphone or loads of cameras, and you can just drive those around battlefields and use them as intelligence gathering tools. Use them with silent watch and leave them in a bush somewhere, and you've literally just now got a mobile CCTV camera with a microphone on it. And this is going to directly feed into things like battlefield management systems. This is going to be the big hot topic for a lot of armoured vehicles going forwards. That instead of having 15 officers sat around a map in a room, very much like World War II looking at a bird's table, you can have on a computer a live feed of where your troops are, where the direction of enemy troops are. Some of the smarter BMS systems, or battlefield management systems, have the ability to track the most likely and the most deadly courses of action from enemy operations. So you can see this is where they're likely going to come from. this is where they're going to send people. And all of these UGVs offer great assets to build and develop and work alongside these BMSs. The final two then are kind of these more combat operations roles. Combat UGVs, as we've already mentioned, so the ability to just have a car size, if not smaller vehicle with a large weapon on the top, and that then becomes your offensive fighting power. Why send human beings through a door? Why send human beings across a field? Why use human beings to hold terrain when you can that you care about dying, but you certainly don't care about it dying as much as a human being. And then the final thing then is kind of, I like to call it my little soapbox thing when I'm talking to people about UGVs, is these swarms. The ability to have 1,000 robots rolling across a field when there's less than 1,000 rounds of ammunition on the other side, because you're rolling it at a section of 8 people who've got 30 rounds to 180 rounds a person. There's no chance you're going to be able to survive that. And I think one of the questions people have asked me before is this an exciting market to be looking into? I think if you're a manufacturer, it's incredibly exciting. If you're somebody that's going to see these in reality, it's horrifying.